Lily Thompson's world was one of shadows and silence. At just 5 years old, she should have been laughing and playing like the other children in the neighborhood, but instead, she lived in constant fear. Her mother, Vanessa, had once been a woman full of life, a loving mother who had dreams of a better future for herself and her daughter. But somewhere along the way, the bright spark in Vanessa's eyes had faded, replaced by the numbness of addiction and the crushing weight of bad decisions. Vanessa's life had spiraled out of control when she met Rico, a man whose reputation was as dangerous as his smile was charming. Rico wasn't the kind of man Vanessa's mother had warned her about. He was smooth, persuasive, and promising. He offered her an escape from the grinding poverty she had been trapped in for years, but his promises were empty, and his love was manipulative. As their relationship deepened, so did Vanessa's dependence on drugs, and soon she was a shell of the woman she once was. Lily had noticed the change long before anyone else. But what could a little girl do? Her mother had stopped listening, stopped seeing the damage she was causing. The house that had once been a safe haven now felt like a prison. The walls, once painted in cheerful colors, had become stained with neglect. Dirty dishes piled up, and the air smelled of old cigarettes and stale food. Lily's toys were scattered across the floor, but she rarely played with them anymore. She spent most of her time curled up in the corner of the living room, watching the door, waiting for her mother to come home from another night out with Rico. Sometimes she would fall asleep on the couch, waking up to the sounds of shouting or crashing glass in the other room. Rico wasn't just a drug dealer. He was a controlling figure, using fear as a tool to bend people to his will. He had no patience for Lily, no love for a child who was an obstacle in his way. He often said things like, "She's in the way," or "She needs to learn her place." Vanessa, high on the drugs that kept her from facing reality, did nothing to stop him. Lily would wake up to find her mother passed out, her body limp and unresponsive on the couch, and Rico lurking in the background, a shadow who only seemed to grow darker the more time passed. As days blended into weeks, Lily grew used to the constant tension that filled the air. She had learned not to cry out, not to scream when the pain was too much, because she knew no one would hear her. Her mother didn't care, and the world outside seemed far too dangerous to seek help from. Sometimes, when Vanessa was lucid enough, she would glance at her daughter and say she was sorry, but those moments were fleeting. The drugs were always more powerful than any motherly instinct. By then, Lily's hair had started to fall out from stress, her body weakened from hunger, and her once sparkling eyes had dulled. She was a child, but she had learned things no child should ever know. Fear had become her constant companion, and she no longer trusted the idea of home being a safe place. Every day was the same, wondering if this would be the day when things went too far. But even though she was small, and her voice was barely a whisper in the chaos, Lily had begun to understand something. The life she once knew, filled with warmth and security, was slipping away, replaced by a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Rico's behavior towards Lily had always been cold, but over time, it began to turn into something darker, something far more sinister. It wasn't just the neglect or the harsh words he used when Vanessa wasn't around. It was the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to find amusement in her fear. At first, he would call her useless, a burden on her mother. Then the cruelty escalated. It started with small acts of aggression, his loud, angry voice when Lily did something he didn't like. Sometimes it was something as simple as spilling juice on the floor, or not putting away her toys fast enough. At first, Vanessa would intervene, but over time, she stopped. She stopped defending her daughter, stopped even noticing the way Rico's anger simmered every time Lily was around. She was either too numb or too afraid of him to do anything. Rico's temper grew worse. He would come home late at night after a day spent in the dark world of drugs and violence. And when he was drunk or high, that's when his true nature would reveal itself. He would find excuses to punish Lily for no reason at all. A look, a word, even a simple movement that irritated him was enough to make her the target of his wrath. He would slap her, push her, or grab her by the arms so hard that bruises formed under the pressure of his hands. Lily, so young and scared, learned to stay out of his way, to be as small and quiet as possible, hoping he wouldn't notice her. But he did notice. And the more Lily tried to avoid him, the more he seemed to seek her out. One night, when Vanessa was passed out on the couch, Rico dragged Lily into the filthy bathroom. The room smelled of mold, and the tile floor was sticky, covered in dirt. He locked the door behind them, trapping her in a place where no one could hear her screams. Lily had learned to keep quiet when Rico was angry, but this time something inside of her snapped. She couldn't understand why he was doing this, why he was so angry, why her mother didn't stop him. As Rico turned to look at the dog, Lily's heart raced. She had never seen this side of him before, and she didn't know what was coming next. Rico's eyes turned cold as he pointed to the dog's mess on the floor. His voice was low and cruel as he told her to eat it. Her stomach turned at the sight, and she instinctively took a step back, but he grabbed her by the hair, yanking her forward until she stumbled to the ground. His hands were like iron on her scalp as he pulled her closer. She could feel her hair ripping from her head in clumps. It was as though her whole world was coming apart at the seams. But nothing was worse than the vile command that followed. Tears filled Lily's eyes, but she didn't cry out. She had learned that crying only made things worse. Rico's face twisted with satisfaction as he watched her struggle, unable to understand the cruelty of what he was doing. His eyes were cold, calculating. There was no humanity in them, no mercy. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but she was trapped, powerless, with no one to save her. Her stomach churned as she realized what he wanted from her, but she couldn't stop herself from doing what he demanded. His grip on her hair tightened, forcing her to comply, to do what he ordered as the room spun around her. Every part of her mind screamed for it to end, but her body was no longer hers to control. She was nothing more than an object in his twisted game, a victim of his cruelty, with no one to protect her from the monster who had taken over her life. This was no longer a man. This was a predator, feeding on the innocence of a child. And the worst part was that Lily couldn't escape, couldn't stop him. The nightmare had become her reality. Vanessa Thompson had once been a woman full of dreams and love for her daughter. But addiction had slowly eroded everything that made her who she was. She had become a shell of the mother Lily had once known, swallowed up by the grip of drugs and the toxic relationship with Rico. Vanessa didn't know how to love her daughter anymore, not the way she needed to be loved. Her focus was always on the next high, on the fleeting moments of escape that came from the drugs that numbed her mind. The life she once wanted for herself and Lily had long been buried under the weight of her own choices. In the beginning, there had been signs, small things that Vanessa couldn't ignore. She had caught glimpses of the bruises on Lily's arms and the fear in her daughter's eyes when Rico was around, but she brushed it aside. She told herself that it was just a phase, that things would get better. But as the days stretched into months, and as Rico's cruelty deepened, so did Vanessa's indifference. She had stopped listening to Lily's silent cries for help, stopped seeing the signs that her daughter was falling apart. One evening, after a long day of being high, Vanessa woke to the sound of Lily's sobs. It was a soft, broken sound that filled the empty room, and for a moment, Vanessa's eyes cleared. She looked at her daughter, who was curled up on the couch, her small body trembling in fear. The mother's heart, for a brief second, caught a glimmer of guilt. She saw the bruises on Lily's face, the bloodshot eyes, the hollow look that no child should have. But instead of rushing to her daughter's side, instead of offering comfort, Vanessa did nothing. She simply stared, too numb to act. Lily's cries were almost inaudible now. She had learned not to disturb her mother when she was in this state, not to make a fuss when things were bad. She had learned to be silent, to suffer in silence as her mother drifted further away into a world of oblivion. Vanessa didn't seem to notice, didn't seem to care. It was as though the drugs had hollowed her out, leaving only an empty shell behind. Rico came and went, always carrying with him a sense of menace that seemed to permeate the air when he was around. His anger was unpredictable, and when Vanessa was too high to intervene, Lily was left to face him alone. The smallest things would set him off. A misplaced toy, a glass of spilled water, or even the wrong look would be enough for him to lash out at Lily. His words were often cutting, meant to tear down any sense of self-worth the little girl had left. Vanessa should have stepped in. She should have protected her daughter, should have been the one to keep Rico's cruelty at bay. But the drugs, the manipulation, and the fear had all taken their toll. Vanessa couldn't see past her own need for escape. She was drowning in her addiction, and in that haze, Lily was nothing more than a burden to her. Days passed like this, a blur of neglect, pain, and indifference. Vanessa's mind was a fog, and every moment she spent awake was a moment spent in a desperate pursuit of her next fix. When Lily would approach her, looking for something, anything, resembling love or affection, Vanessa would push her away, too lost in her own world to even acknowledge her daughter's needs. The bond that once tied them together had been severed, replaced by a coldness that filled the house. Lily in turn had stopped hoping for her mother's love, for her mother's protection. She had learned that her mother would never come to save her. No amount of pleading, no amount of tears would ever reach the woman who had been swallowed up by addiction. The only thing Lily could do was endure. She couldn't escape, couldn't run, because there was nowhere to go. There was no one left who cared enough to save her from the hell she was living in. This was her reality now. She had come to understand that the woman who had once promised to protect her would never do so again. Lily was alone. The neighbors had long suspected something was wrong in the Thompson household. The once quiet and peaceful home had become a place of mystery and unease. For months, the sound of shouting, objects crashing, and the unmistakable sound of a child crying echoed from the house, yet no one dared to intervene. The walls, which once separated their lives, now seemed to close in on the little girl who was being tortured behind them. The neighbors heard Lily's cries in the middle of the night, her muffled sobs barely escaping through the thin walls. But they all chose to turn a blind eye, hoping that things would improve on their own. Mrs. Caldwell, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next door for over 30 years, had always kept a watchful eye on the neighborhood. She had known Lily since she was a toddler, her small face full of joy and wonder. But as the months passed, the little girl she had once seen playing outside, laughing with friends, began to disappear. Instead, she was replaced by a shadow of the child she used to know. Mrs. Caldwell noticed how Lily's face had grown thinner, her clothes more ragged, and her once vibrant eyes now dull and hollow. One evening, as Mrs. Caldwell sat in her living room, reading a book by the window, she saw something that made her heart stop. She hadn't meant to pry, but there, through the gap in the curtains, she saw Rico dragging Lily by her arm down the front steps. The way he held her was not one of care, but of power and dominance. He pushed her forward, and she stumbled on the steps, struggling to keep her balance. Mrs. Caldwell's breath caught in her throat as she saw Lily fall to the ground. The little girl didn't cry out, didn't move, as if she had grown used to the pain, to being treated like nothing more than an object. The image stayed with Mrs. Caldwell, haunting her in the quiet of the night. She had always prided herself on being a good neighbor, on looking out for the children in her community. But now, the reality of what was happening next door was undeniable. She could no longer ignore the signs. The following day, Mrs. Caldwell went outside, trying to gather the courage to speak to Vanessa. She had to know if the rumors were true, if the child's suffering was as bad as it seemed. She approached the front door, knocked, and waited. It took a long time before the door creaked open, revealing Vanessa's disheveled figure. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her clothes were stained. She looked as if she had just woken up, groggy from a long night of drugs. "Oh, it's you," Vanessa muttered, barely acknowledging the neighbor's presence. "I just wanted to check on Lily," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice wavering. "I haven't seen her around lately. Is everything all right?" Vanessa's eyes flickered with a hint of irritation, but she quickly masked it with a lazy, indifferent smile. "She's fine. She's just staying inside today. Nothing to worry about." Mrs. Caldwell could see the lie in Vanessa's eyes. She could see the emptiness behind them. The woman wasn't even trying to hide the truth anymore. Lily wasn't fine. She wasn't just staying inside. She was suffering. But Mrs. Caldwell didn't press further. The last thing she wanted was to make the situation worse. She had seen how quickly Rico could turn violent, and she didn't want to put herself in danger. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something needed to be done. That evening, as she sat in her living room, the sounds of Lily's crying echoed again, louder than ever. This time, it was not just a faint sound that could be ignored, but a heart-wrenching scream that pierced through the walls. Mrs. Caldwell could no longer stay silent. She picked up the phone and dialed the number she had been afraid to call for so long, the number for Child Protective Services. As the phone rang, her hands shook, and her stomach twisted in fear. But she knew she had to do it. If she didn't, no one else would. The silence had lasted long enough. Mrs. Caldwell took a deep breath as she spoke to the operator, giving them as much detail as she could. The truth needed to be known. Lily's cries couldn't be ignored any longer. The child was trapped, and someone had to be the one to help her escape. With that one phone call, the fragile balance of Lily's world began to shift. The nightmare that had been ignored for so long was about to be exposed. The morning after, the phone call, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder and louder as they approached the Thompson house. Inside, Vanessa was still in a drug-induced haze, unaware that her life was about to change. She hadn't seen the police coming, hadn't heard the sound of the officers' boots pounding on the porch, or the knock at the door. But the moment they arrived, everything started to unravel. Lily was asleep on the couch, her small body curled into a ball, trying to escape from the harsh reality of her world. The bruises on her arms were barely hidden by the thin fabric of her clothes, and the dirt on her face had become a permanent fixture. She had learned to sleep through the chaos, to block out the noise that surrounded her. But this morning, it was different. There was something about the tension in the air that made her stir, something that made her sit up and look around the room with a sense of dread. The front door was kicked open with force, and the police rushed inside, their heavy boots echoing through the house. Vanessa jolted awake at the sound, but by the time she lifted her head, it was too late. The officers were already there, their presence too overwhelming for her to process. She blinked, confused and disoriented, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Ma'am, we need to talk," one of the officers said, his voice firm but not unkind. Vanessa didn't answer right away. She looked at Lily, who had remained eerily still on the couch, her wide, terrified eyes locked on the officers. Vanessa felt a wave of panic rise in her chest, a sudden fear of what was coming. She had no idea how much the authorities knew, how much had been exposed, but she could sense the weight of it. She could feel the walls closing in. "What is this about?" Vanessa asked, her voice weak. She tried to stand, but swayed on her feet, her body unsteady. "We're here to take Lily," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The words hit Vanessa like a slap to the face. Her mind spun, but the more she tried to understand, the more the reality of the situation became clear. She had known that this day might come, but she had never imagined it would come like this. The police had seen the signs, had seen the bruises, the neglect. It didn't matter that Vanessa had tried to cover it up, that she had done everything she could to hide the truth from the world. The truth had come out, and now it was too late to stop it. She turned to Lily, her heart racing. The little girl was still staring at the officers, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Hope. It was a brief flash, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Lily had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to see her, to rescue her, from the nightmare she had been living in for so long. The officers moved quickly, their actions decisive. One of them knelt beside Lily, speaking softly to her as they gently helped her to her feet. She didn't resist, didn't make a sound, but her hands were shaking as they led her to the door. Vanessa reached out, but it was too late. She was already losing her. "Wait, I didn't mean for this to happen," Vanessa stammered, but her words were hollow. She knew they weren't going to listen. She had failed her daughter, and no amount of pleading could undo the damage that had been done. "Lily is going to a safe place now," the officer said firmly, not giving her a chance to argue. "You're under arrest for child neglect and abuse." The weight of his words hit Vanessa hard. She had been so focused on her own survival, so consumed by her addiction, that she had failed to protect the one person who needed her the most. Now, her life was spiraling out of control, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the officers led Lily out of the house, Vanessa was left behind, her world crumbling. She was alone now, truly alone, and there was no escaping the reality of what she had allowed to happen. For the first time in years, she felt the full impact of her choices, but for Lily, it was the beginning of something new. The small, fragile girl who had suffered in silence for so long was finally free. And though her journey was far from over, she now had a chance to heal, to rebuild, and to find the love and safety that had been denied her for so long. Lily's journey from the broken house she had once called home to the foster care facility felt like a blur, as if the world was spinning too fast for her to catch her breath. The officers who had taken her there tried their best to comfort her, but there was nothing they could do to erase the terror that had been etched into her soul for the past few years. She had been so used to the chaos, to the endless fear that filled every corner of her life, that the calmness of her new surroundings felt foreign. For the first time, she found herself in a place where she didn't have to hide, where there were no shadows lurking in every corner. The foster care facility was clean and bright, with soft walls painted in calming colors. There were other children there, some laughing, others playing quietly in the corner, but none of them looked like Lily. They were all different ages, different backgrounds, and none of them carried the same heavy weight of fear and suffering that she had carried for so long. She was a child, yes, but the darkness she had lived through had aged her in ways that no one could understand. She had been forced to grow up too fast, and now she felt like an outsider in a world that should have been her sanctuary. But there was something different about this place. The workers were kind, though they never pushed her to talk. They simply let her be, offering gentle smiles, a warm meal, and a safe place to sleep. At night, when the other children fell asleep in their beds, Lily would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness of the world outside. It was quiet here, almost too quiet, and it made her wonder if this peace was real. Could this really be the world she was meant to live in? Or was it just another dream that would shatter like the others? Days passed, and with each passing day, Lily began to learn what it felt like to be cared for. She was given food that she didn't have to fight for, a bed that wasn't cold and uncomfortable, and adults who didn't scream or hurt her. For the first time in years, she started to smile again, though it was a slow process. Her eyes, which had once been dull and lifeless, began to glimmer with a flicker of hope. But even as she began to heal, the weight of what had happened still lingered. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, her body drenched in sweat. She could still hear the harsh words, feel the pull of Rico's hand in her hair, and taste the fear that had consumed her every waking moment. Those memories clung to her, no matter how much she wanted to forget. But in this new place, there were people who helped her understand that it was okay to be afraid, that it was okay to feel what she had been through. One of the workers, a kind woman named Sarah, took a particular interest in Lily. She saw the way the girl hesitated to trust anyone, the way she flinched when someone moved too quickly. Sarah didn't push her to talk, but instead sat with her, drawing pictures, reading stories, and letting Lily take her time. Slowly, Lily began to trust Sarah, began to open up just a little. She never spoke about the things that had happened in the house, never told anyone about the torment she had endured. But there was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken promise that Sarah would be there, and that Lily would be safe. Over time, the therapists at the facility began to work with Lily, helping her process the trauma she had endured. They were patient with her, gentle with their questions, and allowed her to take things at her own pace. It wasn't easy. There were days when Lily would retreat into herself, days when the nightmares would take over, when the fear would flood back in. But little by little, she began to understand that the past didn't have to define her. One day, after several months in the foster care facility, Lily's caseworker informed her that they had found a new family for her, one that was kind, stable, and ready to provide her with the love and security she had always deserved. It was a bittersweet moment. Lily had never known what it meant to have a real family, and the idea of leaving the place that had kept her safe filled her with both hope and fear. Would this new family really love her? Could she trust them not to hurt her like Rico had? But Sarah reassured her, telling her that this was the next step in her journey, that she had come a long way, and that the future was full of possibilities. And so, with a heavy heart but a glimmer of hope, Lily prepared to leave the foster care facility and take the next step into a new life. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she felt a sense of possibility. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be loved, she could be safe, and she could be happy again. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was no longer the scared little girl who had been trapped in a nightmare. She was stronger now, and that strength would carry her through whatever came next.